June 17, 1944. Colonel Takeshi Ogawa stood at the entrance of a reinforced concrete bunker on Saipan's eastern ridge, watching something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Through his field glasses, he observed what appeared to be standard M4 Sherman tanks advancing across the volcanic sand, but with an absurd modification. Where the main gun should have been, the Americans had mounted what looked like an oversized nozzle. Behind the turret, additional armor plating protected what seemed to be fuel tanks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ogawa lowered his binoculars and turned to his second-in-command, Major Hideaki Yamada, with a smile that bordered on contempt. "The Americans have finally lost their minds," he said. "They've replaced their cannons with garden hoses. What do they plan to do, wash us out of our positions?" Yamada chuckled, a sound that echoed through the bunker's entrance. The other officers gathered around joined in the laughter. These were men who had spent months preparing Saipan's defenses, transforming the island into what they believed was an impregnable fortress. They had studied American tactics extensively, analyzed reports from Tarawa and Kwajalein, and concluded that Japanese defensive positions, when properly constructed and manned by soldiers willing to die for the emperor, could withstand any assault. The concept of a tank that shot fire instead of shells struck them as the desperate innovation of an enemy running out of effective ideas. "Our positions are built into solid rock and reinforced concrete," Ogawa continued, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had never been wrong. "Fire cannot penetrate stone. This is a waste of their industrial capacity, turning perfectly good tanks into useless toys. They might as well be throwing matches at us." What Colonel Ogawa did not know, could not have known from his position of absolute confidence, was that he was looking at the M4A3R3, a weapon system that would redefine the nature of Pacific warfare and transform his impregnable fortress into a crematorium. Within 72 hours, his laughter would be replaced by screams. His certainty would dissolve into horror. And his defensive positions, carved deep into Saipan's volcanic rock, would become mass graves for over 8,000 Japanese defenders who had believed, as he did, that American ingenuity was no match for Japanese determination. The confidence that Colonel Ogawa displayed on that June morning was not personal arrogance. It was the product of a carefully constructed military doctrine that had been refined over decades and validated, in Japanese eyes, by early victories in the Pacific War. To understand why experienced officers could laugh at a weapon that would soon destroy them, we must understand the foundation of beliefs upon which they stood. Japanese military thinking in 1944 had been shaped by centuries of samurai tradition emphasizing spiritual fortitude over material advantage. This philosophy had been modernized and weaponized by the Imperial Army, creating a doctrine that elevated willingness to die above technological superiority. Officers like Ogawa had been trained at military academies where they studied not just tactics and strategy, but a comprehensive worldview that placed Japanese soldiers at the pinnacle of military effectiveness. Central to this worldview was the concept of Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan, which supposedly gave Japanese forces an intangible advantage that mere weapons could not overcome. Training manuals explicitly taught that one Japanese soldier possessed the fighting spirit of 10 American soldiers. This was not presented as motivational rhetoric but as factual analysis supported by selective interpretation of early war victories. The fall of Singapore, the initial successes in the Philippines, and the shocking effectiveness of Japanese forces during the first year of the Pacific War had reinforced these beliefs. Japanese officers had witnessed British and American forces surrendering despite superior numbers and equipment. They had seen their own soldiers achieve seemingly impossible victories through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice. These experiences created a feedback loop that confirmed what they had been taught since childhood: spirit trumped steel, determination defeated technology, and the Japanese warrior was fundamentally superior to his Western counterpart. Colonel Ogawa himself embodied this tradition. Born in 1903 in Hiroshima Prefecture, he had attended the Imperial Japanese Army Academy during the height of militaristic fervor in the 1920s. His instructors were veterans of the Russo-Japanese War, men who had witnessed Japanese forces defeat a European power through tactics that emphasized aggressive spirit and willingness to accept casualties that Western armies would consider catastrophic. Ogawa had excelled in his studies, particularly in defensive warfare theory. He had written papers analyzing the failure of French defensive positions during World War I, concluding that the French had lost not because their Maginot Line was poorly designed, but because the soldiers manning it lacked the spiritual commitment to defend it properly. A properly motivated force in well-designed positions, he argued, was virtually undefeatable. The attacker would always suffer disproportionate casualties trying to dig defenders out of prepared positions. This theory had been put into practice on Saipan with meticulous attention to detail. The island's natural geography favored defense. Volcanic rock provided excellent material for tunnel construction. Coral limestone could be shaped into reinforced positions. The terrain, with its ridges and caves, offered countless opportunities for creating mutually supporting defensive positions that could survive naval bombardment and provide protected firing positions against advancing infantry. Ogawa had spent 5 months overseeing the construction of Saipan's eastern defenses. His engineers had carved tunnels 15 feet deep into solid rock. They had created firing ports that were nearly invisible from the outside but provided excellent fields of fire. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They had positioned machine gun nests to create overlapping kill zones. They had stockpiled ammunition in chambers protected by multiple feet of stone and concrete. They had even installed ventilation systems to allow defenders to survive for days if positions became sealed. The defensive complex that Ogawa commanded was a masterpiece of military engineering, designed to exploit every lesson learned from previous island battles. Unlike the exposed positions that had been destroyed at Tarawa, these bunkers were deeply buried. Unlike the positions at Kwajalein that had been flanked, these were positioned to provide mutual support. Unlike earlier defensive lines that had single points of failure, Ogawa's system was redundant and layered. When American forces had begun their preliminary bombardment of Saipan on June 13, Ogawa's confidence had only grown. He had watched shells from American battleships slam into the ridgeline above his positions. He had felt the earth shake as bombs from carrier aircraft struck the surrounding terrain. He had seen massive explosions that would have obliterated surface positions. Yet when the bombardment paused, his defensive network remained intact. Communication lines were functional. Firing positions were undamaged. His garrison was ready. The American pre-landing bombardment, while impressive in scale, had validated everything Ogawa believed about defensive warfare. American forces possessed overwhelming firepower, this was undeniable. But firepower alone could not defeat properly constructed positions manned by determined defenders. The Americans would have to come ashore, they would have to advance under fire, and when they did, they would encounter a defensive system designed specifically to maximize their casualties while minimizing Japanese losses. Major Yamada, Ogawa's second-in-command, shared this confidence but with a slightly different perspective. Yamada was younger, born in 1912, and had seen combat in China before being assigned to Saipan. His experience fighting Chinese forces had taught him that Asian soldiers could endure hardships that Westerners could not. He had witnessed Japanese units operate for weeks with minimal supplies, fight effectively despite hunger and disease, and maintain combat effectiveness under conditions that would have caused Western units to collapse. Yamada had also developed a particular contempt for American tactical abilities. He had studied reports from Guadalcanal and analyzed American operational patterns. Americans, he concluded, relied heavily on firepower to compensate for lack of individual soldier quality. They advanced slowly, called in extensive artillery and air support before every movement, and showed a marked reluctance to accept casualties. This risk-averse approach, while understandable from a materialistic Western perspective, created predictable patterns that Japanese defenders could exploit. When Yamada first heard about American flamethrower tanks, his initial reaction had been analytical rather than dismissive. He understood that Americans were innovative, that their industrial capacity allowed them to experiment with new weapons systems. But after studying the concept, he had concluded that it represented a tactical dead end. Flamethrowers had limited range, perhaps 30 or 40 meters at most. To use them effectively, tanks would have to approach very close to defensive positions, exposing themselves to anti-tank weapons. The fuel required for flame projection would make the tanks vulnerable to any penetrating hit. And most critically, flame could not penetrate the kind of fortifications that covered Saipan's defensive positions. The other officers in Ogawa's command shared similar assessments. Captain Kenji Matsumoto, who commanded the anti-tank gun positions, had calculated optimal firing solutions for engaging the modified Shermans. Without their main guns, he reasoned, the flamethrower tanks would be helpless against fortified positions at medium range. His 47mm anti-tank guns could disable them before they got close enough to use their flame weapons. It was almost too easy. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, responsible for infantry coordination, had developed tactics specifically for countering close-range armored threats. His men had been trained to remain concealed until tanks passed their positions, then emerge to attack from the sides and rear where armor was weakest. Against conventional tanks with rotating turrets, this tactic was dangerous. Against tanks that could only project flame forward, it seemed almost foolproof. This collective confidence was reinforced by the broader strategic situation. By June 1944, Japanese forces had been retreating across the Pacific for over a year. Islands that were supposed to be held indefinitely had fallen in days or weeks. Each defeat had been analyzed, explanations developed, and lessons supposedly learned. The consistent conclusion was that previous commanders had failed not because Japanese defensive doctrine was flawed, but because they had implemented it improperly. They had not dug deep enough, had not been sufficiently ruthless in maintaining discipline, had not fully embraced the philosophy of fighting to the last man. Saipan was going to be different. The garrison of over 30,000 troops had been carefully selected and indoctrinated. The defensive positions were the most sophisticated yet constructed in the Pacific. The garrison had adequate supplies stockpiled to withstand a prolonged siege. Most importantly, the defenders were psychologically prepared to die rather than surrender. This was not empty rhetoric. Officers like Ogawa genuinely believed that their willingness to sacrifice everything gave them an advantage that American materialism could never overcome. So when those modified Shermans appeared on the morning of June 17, trundling across the volcanic sand with their strange nozzles and additional armor plating, the reaction was not fear but satisfaction mixed with amusement. Here was proof that Americans were running out of effective tactics. Here was evidence that Japanese defensive doctrine was forcing the enemy to resort to desperate innovations. Here was validation that Saipan's defenders, properly positioned and properly motivated, could withstand whatever the materially superior Americans could throw at them. Colonel Ogawa returned to his command post deep within the ridge, confident that the next few days would demonstrate the superiority of Japanese defensive tactics over American industrial might. He issued orders to his unit commanders reminding them to hold fire until the modified tanks came within range of anti-tank weapons. He emphasized the importance of destroying these flamethrower vehicles quickly to demoralize the American infantry that would presumably be following them. What Ogawa could not see from his reinforced command post, could not know from his analysis of previous battles, could not imagine despite his extensive military education, was that the M4A3R3 represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. The Americans had not simply mounted a flamethrower on a tank. They had created a weapon system specifically designed to solve the exact problem that Ogawa's defenses presented: fortified positions too deep to be destroyed by conventional weapons, too well protected to be overcome by direct assault, too cleverly positioned to be easily flanked. The flamethrower tank did not defeat fortifications by penetrating them. It defeated them by turning them into ovens. Fire did not need to breach concrete and stone. It needed only to enter through the firing ports and ventilation systems that made the bunkers functional defensive positions. Once inside, the nature of enclosed spaces became a liability rather than an asset. Fire consumed oxygen. Burning fuel created toxic gases. The stone and concrete that protected against shells and bullets conducted heat with lethal efficiency. Positions designed to withstand bombardment became death traps when filled with flame. But these realities were still theoretical on the morning of June 17. The proof would come soon enough, delivered in jets of burning fuel that would transform Colonel Ogawa's masterpiece of defensive engineering into a hell that no amount of spiritual fortitude could endure. The laughter that echoed through the command bunker that morning would be the last moment of confidence that Saipan's defenders would experience. By evening, as the first screams began to filter through the communication lines, a very different sound would fill those stone corridors. The sound of men realizing that everything they believed about modern warfare was catastrophically, fatally wrong. The first M4A3R3 reached the base of Ogawa's Ridge at 0847 hours. Sergeant William Hayes from Tuscaloosa, Alabama sat in the driver's position, following the path that combat engineers had marked through the minefield the previous night. Behind him, Corporal James Mitchell operated the flame gun controls, a system that had been installed at the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard just 3 months earlier. Mitchell's training had been brief, less than 2 weeks of practice shots at mock bunkers constructed on Maui. But the principle was simple enough. Aim the nozzle at the target, open the valves, trigger the ignition. From his position in the bunker complex, Captain Matsumoto watched the modified Sherman lumber closer. His anti-tank gun crew had the vehicle zeroed in at 400 meters. But Matsumoto held his fire. The standing orders were clear. Wait until multiple targets presented themselves. Conserve ammunition. Make every shot count. Besides, he wanted to see what this ridiculous contraption would actually attempt to do. At 200 meters, Mitchell identified his first target. A concrete pillbox built into the ridge face, its firing slit barely visible against the volcanic rock. The structure had been designed to be nearly invisible from the beach, positioned to provide enfilading fire against troops advancing along the coastal road. Naval bombardment had left it completely unmarked. Direct fire from conventional tanks had achieved nothing more than scorching the concrete surface. Hayes brought the Sherman to a halt at 60 meters, the closest approach that terrain allowed. Through his periscope, Mitchell could see the dark rectangle of the firing port. He aligned the nozzle, made a final adjustment for elevation, and activated the system. The first burst of flame arced across the gap in a trajectory that seemed almost lazy, thick and orange in the bright Pacific sunlight. It struck the concrete face of the pillbox and splashed upward, creating a momentary curtain of fire that obscured the entire structure. Inside the pillbox, Private First Class Takeo Ishida had been tracking the modified tank through his machine gun sight, waiting for the order to fire. He saw the flame gun elevate, register that it was aiming directly at his position, and experienced a moment of confusion about what possible threat this could represent. The firing port was less than 8 inches wide. What were the Americans thinking? Then the flame arrived. It did not simply splash against the exterior concrete as Ishida had assumed it would. The pressurized fuel, a mixture of gasoline and a thickening agent that made it cling to surfaces, poured through the firing slit with the inexorable force of liquid under pressure seeking any available opening. In less than 2 seconds, the interior of the pillbox was filled with burning gel that adhered to every surface including the 3 men inside. Ishida's screams could be heard clearly by the soldiers in adjacent positions. The sound carried through the interconnected tunnel system that Ogawa had designed for communication and mutual support. Within moments, the carefully constructed network of bunkers became a transmission system for horror, carrying the sounds of men burning alive to defenders throughout the complex. Captain Matsumoto, hearing the screams through his communication line, gave the order to engage the flamethrower tank. His anti-tank gun fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. All 3 struck the Sherman's frontal armor. All 3 failed to penetrate. The additional armor plating that Ogawa's officers had mocked as wasted weight was proving its worth. The Sherman, designed to survive hits from German anti-tank guns far more powerful than Matsumoto's 47mm weapon, shrugged off the attack and moved to its next target. Mitchell had already identified the source of the anti-tank fire. The muzzle flash had given away the position, another bunker carved into the ridge approximately 40 meters to the right of the first target. This one was larger, a reinforced gun emplacement that would have required multiple direct hits from a conventional tank's main gun to disable. Mitchell adjusted his aim and sent a sustained burst of flame toward the position. The anti-tank gun's barrel protruded from an opening designed to provide maximum traverse while minimizing exposure. This opening, essential for the gun's function, became the pathway for destruction. Burning fuel poured into the emplacement, engulfing the gun crew and igniting the ammunition stored inside. The secondary explosion that followed sent smoke and debris fontaining from every opening in the bunker complex. By 0920 hours, Hayes and Mitchell had neutralized 7 defensive positions along the eastern ridge. Each engagement followed the same pattern. Identify the bunker by its firing ports or gun barrels. Approach to effective range. Pour flame into any opening. Move to the next target while the previous position burned. The efficiency was methodical, almost industrial. This was not combat as the Japanese had understood it. This was extermination. Colonel Ogawa, in his command bunker 200 meters back from the ridge face, listened to the deteriorating situation through increasingly frantic radio reports. His carefully constructed defensive system was collapsing bunker by bunker. Officers who had been supremely confident that morning were now screaming contradictory orders. Some demanded that positions be held regardless of the flame attacks. Others, hearing the screams of burning men through the tunnel networks, were ordering evacuations that exposed troops to American rifle fire. Major Yamada entered the command post, his face showing the first cracks in the certainty that had characterized his demeanor for months. "Sir, we need to reconsider our defensive posture. The flamethrower tanks are neutralizing our forward positions faster than we can respond. Perhaps we should withdraw to the secondary defensive line where we have better fields of fire for our anti-tank weapons." Ogawa's response was immediate and sharp. "We will not abandon positions we have spent months preparing. The Americans have a limited number of these modified tanks. Once they exhaust their fuel supply, they will be forced to withdraw. Our troops must endure. They must maintain their positions. This is exactly the kind of test that separates superior forces from inferior ones." But the test was proving impossible to pass. By midday, 3 more M4A3R3 tanks had joined the attack, operating in coordination with conventional Shermans and infantry. The flamethrower tanks would neutralize bunkers while conventional tanks provided covering fire and suppressed any defensive positions that tried to engage the vulnerable flame vehicles. Infantry followed closely, mopping up any defenders who attempted to evacuate burning positions. Lieutenant Nakamura, whose tactics for attacking tanks from the sides and rear had seemed so promising that morning, discovered that his assumptions were fatally flawed. When his infantry teams attempted to engage the flamethrower tanks from concealed positions, they found that the vehicles were never alone. Conventional Shermans and accompanying infantry cut down his men before they could get close. The few teams that did manage to approach discovered that the additional armor plating extended to the sides and rear of the vehicles, making them far more difficult to disable than standard tanks. By 1400 hours, Nakamura was dead, killed by machine gun fire from a conventional Sherman as he attempted to coordinate an attack on a flamethrower tank that was systematically burning out his defensive positions. His last radio transmission to Ogawa's command post was a request for permission to withdraw that was denied. The afternoon brought a new dimension of horror as the thermal effects of sustained flame attacks began to manifest. Bunkers that had been hit hours earlier remained lethally hot. The stone and concrete that Ogawa had selected for their protective qualities retained heat with devastating efficiency. Defenders attempting to reoccupy positions found them unbearable, the air inside too hot to breathe, the surfaces too hot to touch. The defensive system was becoming a network of ovens that remained deadly long after the flames had been extinguished. Captain Matsumoto, his anti-tank gun position destroyed, had fallen back to a secondary bunker with the survivors of his crew. They had sealed themselves inside, blocking the firing ports with debris in a desperate attempt to prevent flame from entering. But the bunker's ventilation system, designed to allow extended occupation during bombardment, had become a liability. When a flamethrower tank positioned itself above their location and poured flame down the ventilation shaft, the bunker became a chimney in reverse. Burning fuel cascaded through the ventilation system, filling the interior spaces with fire and toxic smoke. Matsumoto survived long enough to crawl to a radio and transmit a final message. The tanks cannot be stopped with conventional weapons. They do not need to penetrate our positions. They only need to find any opening. We were wrong. We were wrong about everything. By 1700 hours, the eastern ridge that Ogawa had transformed into a fortress had been reduced to a smoking ruin. Of the 43 bunkers and pillboxes that had comprised the defensive system, 37 had been neutralized by flame attack. The remaining 6 had been abandoned by their garrisons after watching what happened to their neighboring positions. American casualties in taking the ridge totaled 11 dead and 34 wounded. Japanese casualties exceeded 800, most of them burned beyond recognition in the positions they had been ordered to hold. Ogawa sat in his command bunker as darkness fell, surrounded by the few officers who remained alive. The radio network that had connected his entire defensive system now carried only static, punctuated occasionally by the screams of wounded men trapped in bunkers that were too hot to enter for rescue. The maps on his command table, marked with symbols representing defensive positions and fields of fire, had become abstractions. The actual terrain bore no resemblance to the carefully planned system he had created. Major Yamada, his uniform torn and stained with soot from a near-miss flame attack, spoke quietly. "Sir, we must request permission to conduct a strategic withdrawal to the island's interior. The ridgeline is lost. Remaining here serves no purpose except to provide targets for their flame weapons." For a long moment, Ogawa said nothing. His entire career, his education at the Imperial Academy, his study of defensive warfare, his meticulous planning for Saipan's defense, all of it had been predicated on assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. Japanese defensive positions could not withstand American assault when the Americans possessed weapons specifically designed to exploit the inherent vulnerabilities of fortifications. The stone and concrete that protected against conventional weapons became death traps when attacked with flame. The interconnected tunnel systems that provided communication and mutual support became transmission networks for fire and toxic gases. The deep bunkers that survived naval bombardment became ovens that cooked defenders alive. "We were taught that spirit could overcome material advantage," Ogawa said finally. "We believed that properly constructed positions could withstand any attack if defended by determined men. But there is no amount of determination that allows a man to survive being burned alive. There is no spiritual fortitude that permits soldiers to fight effectively while their comrades scream as they die in fire. The Americans have not simply defeated our tactics. They have made our entire defensive philosophy obsolete." The withdrawal order was given at 2,300 hours. Those units that could disengage did so under cover of darkness, abandoning the fortifications that had taken months to construct. But for thousands of defenders in the ridgeline bunkers and throughout Saipan's defensive network, withdrawal was impossible. They were sealed in positions that had become tombs, surrounded by stone walls that conducted killing heat, breathing air that was toxic with smoke and chemical residue. Over the next 2 days, as American forces expanded their beachhead and pushed inland, flamethrower tanks systematically reduced every fortified position they encountered. The pattern established on the eastern ridge repeated across the island. Japanese defenders, confident in their bunkers and caves, found themselves facing a weapon that turned their protective positions into execution chambers. The screams that echoed from burning bunkers demoralized defenders in neighboring positions, creating a cascade of psychological collapse that was as devastating as the physical destruction. By June 20th, organized Japanese resistance on Saipan had effectively ended, though individual positions continued to fight for weeks. The final casualty count would show over 8,000 Japanese defenders killed, with a disproportionate number dying in fortified positions that were supposed to protect them. American casualties, while still significant, were far lower than pre-invasion estimates that had been based on the assumption that Japanese bunkers would need to be reduced through conventional assault. Colonel Ogawa survived the battle, one of the few senior officers to do so. He was captured on June 28, found in a cave on the island's northern end with a dozen men too wounded to continue fighting. His captors noted that he seemed less concerned with his own fate than with understanding exactly how the flamethrower tanks functioned. He asked detailed technical questions about their range, fuel capacity, and operational limitations, as if still trying to identify some tactical solution that could have defeated them. In his final interrogation before being shipped to a prisoner of war camp in Hawaii, Ogawa was asked by an American intelligence officer if he understood why Japanese defenses had failed. His response was recorded in the interrogation transcript and later became required reading at the Army War College. "We failed because we believed that the laws of warfare were universal and unchanging. We assumed that because fortifications had historically provided advantages to defenders, they always would. We did not account for the possibility that attackers might develop weapons specifically designed to exploit the inherent weaknesses of fortified positions. The flamethrower tank does not defeat bunkers through superior firepower or tactical maneuver. It defeats them by transforming their strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. Every design feature that made our positions strong against conventional weapons, the enclosed spaces, the small openings, the stone construction made them catastrophically vulnerable to flame attack. We were not defeated by American courage or superior tactics. We were defeated by American innovation applied systematically to solve a specific problem that we represented." The lessons of Saipan reverberated through the remaining year of the Pacific War. Japanese forces on subsequent islands attempted to adapt their defensive tactics, creating positions with multiple exits, avoiding enclosed spaces, and dispersing rather than concentrating in fortified complexes. But these adaptations created their own vulnerabilities to conventional weapons, and American forces had already learned the devastating effectiveness of combining flamethrower tanks with traditional infantry and armor tactics. The M4A3R3 and its variants would be used extensively for the remainder of the war, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. Each application refined the tactics and techniques first proven on Saipan's volcanic ridges. The weapon that Colonel Ogawa had laughed at on that June morning became one of the most feared implements in the Pacific Theater, responsible for breaking defensive positions that might have held for weeks against conventional assault. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.